because I was interested in permaculture, and I wouldn't have been able to buy any land where I was living in the east of England. So me and my wife at the time moved over to East Clare, and to have some land, even though the land was boggy and it's Irish land and the weather is different from the east of England. What happened then was Anita and Tommy Hayes, who started the Irish Seed Savers Association, they moved to near where we happened to be living. So then I got a job with them and with Seed Savers, and I ended up running the orchards, the Irish apple collection. Although I didn't go there for apples, I love biodiversity. And so after being there for, I don't know, maybe 11 years, I went to New Zealand for a year, and I worked for a group of people there who were growing seeds for Kainga seeds, which is like the Irish Seed Savers of New Zealand. And when I was in New Zealand, New Zealand's a really buzzy place agriculturally and horticulturally. So I started hearing about this thing, agroecology, and since I was a teenager, I couldn't understand why humans spent so much time running around making money and fighting and arguing with each other just to feed themselves when they could just feed themselves. I was young, but I didn't really know what I was thinking, but they started to condense in my mind. And so when I started to hear about agroecology, I thought, this is making more sense, where we're trying to we're trying to understand our ecology and how we fit into it, and can we actually live with the rest of nature? Because we've seen, everything we seem to do is really aggressive, and you could say it's patriarchy, but it's just what we have. The system we have at the moment is aggressive, and it focuses mainly on economic returns. And I'm not naive enough to think that we don't need money, because it's the system that we've adopted to be able to buy things from each other. But when you put money at the center of everything that you do, that's all your intent is on, is money, and you'll destroy your environment and your ecology and everything. I was kind of drawn towards biodynamics because it has a kind of mystical thing about it. We're now coming out of that, of course, because you can't bring along the rest of society with you on a mystical agriculture. You have to have the science behind it, And from there, I knew Pat Malone from Seed Savers. I used to graft apple trees with Pat Malone. So Pat said about coming here and giving him a hand here, and so that happened just over 10 years ago. So I've been here since. So that's my story. That's how I landed here. So I'm going to talk about here. You hear this memes just trotted about all the time now, and about this place-based kind of realization. That's where we should be. There's a great guy called John Feehan, who's an agricultural historian, poet, a great spiritual man, who comes from Burr, just to the north of us, the town to the north of us. And John's always been here, and he knows the land deeply, intimately, because one of the things that touched me was when I was in the States. I have a friend who's he's a Pima Hopi Native American, and so I spent time in his fields in the desert down there, and their culture is so wrapped into their food that I've been looking at this whole thing of sacredness. It seems to be one of the only things that will stop us destroying things. If something is sacred, it's the last thing we'll sell, is the sacredness. And this is what I realized in their culture. When you're born there, you're given a head of maize in the cradle with you, because this is your relative. The maize is your relative. It's that dug into them. It's that sacred into their lives. Whereas here, pot noodles, anyone? We've kind of gone as far as pot noodles and cheese, And I'm not saying that all of the states has got that, because we went to some places when I was in the States where there's food deserts. They've got loads of liquor stores where you can buy pot noodles, but there's no stores to buy food. And then you've got the situation that they've got in the UK now, which is a lot of people are now living out of food banks, where the supermarket's food is going out of date, so they give it to food banks to feed the poor. Now that's not the best food in supermarkets to start off with. So by the time it's gone into the food banks, it's like it's just stuff you put in you. You know, it doesn't give you that nutritional value that we need to be, you know, a working organism, which is what we are. Is there any more seats?
I guess
just for Jem. Yeah. Okay, so this is the third talk that Tony asked me to do some talks. So this is the third talk, and I called it soil versus dirt, or dirt versus soil, because you get a lot of people saying calling the soil dirt. It's not dirt, it's soil. Now I looked to see where the root of the words come from, and soil came from Latin, which meant either a seat or the ground, and then Middle English changed it gradually to soil, the word soil, whereas dirt comes from Old English, which is probably Saxon, Jute, you know, that kind of area of Europe, and it means mud. So, but what it means to biological farmers is it's not alive, although nothing on this planet is dead, everything is alive. Whereas soil is teeming with life. It's the process that we don't see. When we see a tree, we just see the top of the tree. We don't see the same amount of tree under the ground, where it's interacting with all of these microorganisms and funguses and viruses and ciliates and flagellates and microarthropods that are underneath the ground. I'll talk a bit more about that. And we don't even see that or think about that, and we're only now soil science starting to get to the point where we're developing a better understanding of what's going on under the ground. We know more about space really than we know about what's under the ground. So this is basically what I wanted to talk about. So this place here, 325 million years ago was a sea. And so when you look at the soil here, you'll see lots of bits of rock which are white, this is lime. This comes from the bodies of all of the little crustaceans that were living in this big inland sea here. And so millions of years go by, you know, the sea isn't here anymore, and then we have the glaciers come over the top. So the glaciers came and they were like, you can imagine 10 miles of ice over the top of you, crushing and grinding everything as it came through. And then as the glaciers receded, the whole of the country was mineralized. It was this crushed up, all of these different elements crushed up. And they reckon the first trees that grew after the glaciers were massive because they had access to all of these nutrients. There was high levels of carbon dioxide in the air for them to use for photosynthesis, and much bigger than the trees that we have now, and that created then the later Carboniferous eras where you had coal and diamonds and all of that come from. So understanding that underneath the topsoil, so anyway, sorry, after the glaciers then we had woodlands come in, and thousands of years of woodlands where, you know, trees were growing and dying and growing and dying, and so that built up all of that organic matter over the top of all of these minerals, and the biology was reacting in this whole the minerals from just bare rock minerals into living minerals, and compounding them and making them into different processes and enzymes and vitamins. And this is where we kind of come to where humans came in here. You know, the earliest people came in and they would have lived around the edges of the island. It was just, even right the way up to Cromwell, I don't know, 1700s or whatever, it was still hard to get from one side of Ireland to the other. You either had to go up through the Shannon River, so most people in Europe didn't travel on land. They travelled on boat around the edges and up the rivers and streams, because it was that there was that many trees here. It was totally forested. And then gradually we started kind of slash and burn, and then as we came, our agriculture kind of went through different phases, and so we end up where we are now, which is, this was all part of the domain of Cloughjordan House here, going right the way back to Cromwell, where they probably had cattle and grains and things that they grew here, probably Neolithic hulless barleys and things like that. They would have had they would have had wheat as well. And from then on, we developed a mixed farming system, because we were basically subsistence farmers. We were producing our own food first, and then anything else that we had, we would barter or we would sell for the other little things that came in. And that went right up to quite recently, really, in some areas. That's why Ireland was really unique for a small country to have so many small farms, and we kind of look back on that with a jaded view now, which is really, it destabilized agriculture in Ireland, really, because we have this thing where, we look back on it being poverty, and we look back on it being misery, and the drudgery of the whole thing, the whole experience of farming on a small farm just to be able to live. But there was more behind that as well. People did more themselves. They had self-satisfaction in being able to make things and do things and grow things. And also there was I've looked into the whole thing of community, which seems to be the only sensible way that as a species we can operate with any security, is to create a community. But they're not easy, because humans aren't easy. But necessity is the mother of invention, and so we needed a community. We needed each other to be able to look after ourselves, or borrow things from, or buy things from, or whatever. So we developed these inter-family kind of communities that were here. And but there was still the landlord system, which really put a huge pressure on the land, mainly in the fact that it controlled a lot of the land. And it kind of set up the precedent for where we are today, really. It's the same kind of agriculture, a kind of colonialism where, instead of going into a country and turning it into a colony, we go to the land and turn the land into a colony. And so we have monocultures of things, because that's the only thing we want. And really, we don't even live in this country. We live in another country, and we don't really care about your country. We just care about the product that's coming out of it. So that's kind of where the kind of farming is that we got into today, which is conventional, controlled. A lot of the laws now, there are agricultural laws and rules that farmers have to work under, but there's a lot of subversive stuff going on, using the health authorities and things like that on farms to come round now to farms. I think it's under this thing called Codex Alimentarius. I've had loads of friends who are biological, organic farmers who have been kind of intimidated by Department of Agricultural officials coming round and saying, well, you can't have cats here. They can't have any birds in the polytunnel, because they're obsessed with this, through the insurance companies, they're obsessed with this thing that we're going to poison people if there's birds shitting on your crops, like they've shat on our crops for that. So now they're bringing in these really extreme conditions that have nothing to do with farming whatsoever. They don't have an understanding, and that's a problem when you get a group of people who are farmers, obsessive farmers. They're in it, they study it, it's their life, it's never ending, and a group of bureaucrats who are trying to impose regulations, and they don't come from that same background. They don't understand the paradigm that they're trying to control. So that's the first blurb, which is my opinion, by the way. The we've evolved at looking at the land. We started off way back, say 400 or 500 years ago. For thousands of years we'd been working the land, and our understanding of the whole paradigm that we were looking at was that there were elemental forces at work. There was fire, air, water and earth, and that each of these different elements had like a spiritual association. So these spirits were called elemental beings. So the earth forces, energies, we saw them as being gnomes, or Nome in Germany, and these little grumpy little men who are kind of, or women as well, with beards, a bit like dwarfs, as though we imagine dwarfs, but they kind of held on to precious stones and gold and things in the ground. And then the opposite to the earth, which is air, these were the sylphs, and apparently you could see the sylphs in the tracks behind the swallows when they flew through the air. The sylphs were in there; they were the elements of the air. And then the undines, they were the understanding of water spirits. This was how the water moved through the earth. And then the salamanders, which is fire. So when you bring these four elements together, you get life. You can't grow anything without one of these four elements being missing. If you want to grow something, you have to have, well, unless you're hydroponically inclined, you have to have earth to put your seed in, and then if there's no water, the seed's not going to grow in dry soil, so you have to have water. But then if it's cold, the seed won't grow, so you have to have warmth. And then if you put it in a plastic bag and you give it no air, it will die, because the earth has to have air in it to support the organisms, aerobic organisms that live in the soil. So that's how our ancestors would have seen it, and it's a great paradigm to work in, really. But we have science now to explain the world around us, and science can be a bit more distant than that elemental thing. You can perceive that there are elements in the soil and put your hands in the soil, but you can't see a molecule of nitrogen. You can't see a molecule of oxygen or hydrogen. You can see carbon when we burn a piece of wood and you get charcoal. So now we're working on things which are even more distant in our minds than the reality that we're seeing. So the science that we've developed now, for so long we've been looking at agriculture, using the soil as physics and chemistry. So that's what conventional agriculture is basically around, is physics and chemistry. So physics will be the actual physical construction of things. So what is it? Called anions or cations, which means they have a positive or negative charge, which means they can either stick together or they're repelled from each other. So this is a thing of physics. So if I've got clay and it's hard, that's a physical action of the clay layers together. If I put water on it, which is H2O, and I put water on it, it changes the physical composition of that soil. Then it starts to become looser. So that's the kind of physical aspect of things. And then the chemistry aspect of it was how different chemicals react in that physical element. So that's how we developed, and it came out of the war, because before the war, nitrogen was being actually taken from Chile as Chilean nitrate, which was actually guano, which is the shit from seabirds. Thousands of years of it, mountains of it, islands of it, dug out, fought over, people killed, to transport to Europe to start this whole process. They realized if they put the guano on the land, they got a better yield of things. But so they started to move towards a more chemical side of it. In the war, then the British were stopping the German boats taking the nitrate. So what they did is their chemists worked out this thing. It was two chemists, Haber and Bosch, and so they used immense amounts of energy to extract the nitrogen out of the air and turn it into urea. So it's energy and pressure does this, and it's called the Haber-Bosch process. And from that they started then to use it, other than fertilizer, as bombs. So after the Second World War, all of the chemical technology that had been used and the corporations that had risen to make money out of these elements started to be applied to our agriculture. So, you know, fertilizers came out of the materials we were using in bombs, phosphorus, potassium and nitrogen specifically. And then fungicides also, all of this technology was coming out of these countries. And you then see things like in the UK, before the First World War, no farmer would touch chemical agriculture. They didn't need it. They didn't need it. They were using natural processes. Okay, they couldn't get massive yields like they were promised, but they'd been constantly getting yields and, you know, working on their land. And then afterwards, what happened during the Second World War in the UK was the Agricultural Office took over in the War Department in the British government, and they started then to tell the farmers what they were going to grow. And if you didn't grow what you were told to grow, they'd just take you off the land and put somebody else in there. But then the dodgy bit about it is, at the end of the war, they didn't stop the War Ag Department. That went on for a good bit after the war. Because we know through psychology, if you want to change the perception of a population, you have to have the next generation kind of brainwashed. So what they come along, this is all new, so the old is bad, the new is good. So, you know, you get loads of, I want to be in agriculture, it's a new, go ahead. And we can do things with chemicals now, and, you know, and it's this a better life through science kind of thing that they were pushing. And so they kept the War Ag Department for a good bit after a year to get the next generation indoctrinated. That's the idea of what happened there. So then it was just chemical agriculture took over. Well, I say chemical agriculture took over. It took over in the West. It still isn't big in third world countries. They can still do without it, but again, now what they do is they beat you with you're a poor third world country, you need to have the same technology as us in the first world. We'll give you the green revolution with Norman Borlaug's super producing grains and things that they've said, well, you know, thousands of people have died, but it wasn't Norman Borlaug's varieties that he grew, these short rice and short wheat varieties. What it actually was all of the herbicides that went with these varieties. You know, so that's how we kind of ended up poisoning and destroying India, especially northern India. We wrecked Ethiopia with that science. They've really clawed it back now because they're, especially the gene banks, the guy who was the leader of the Ethiopian gene banks was an absolute hero. And what he did was he realized that when he went to these villages and the villagers would get out all of these different types of teff or sorghum or wheat or something, when he looked at one type of teff and another type of teff, it just looked like teff to him. But the ladies in the villages would say, oh no, that teff's used for this and this one grows at this time of the year. So what he decided was, what's the use of me and academia pushing our ideas onto the people who actually know more than I know? So what they did is they started an amalgamation with the farmers. So the scientists and the farmers work together for the better of the farmers. And so it's amazing now. They would never. The Green Revolution tried to get rid of teff, but you can't get rid of it in Ethiopia because you make injera out of teff, which is like a big sourdough pancake out of it. And Ethiopians love injera. Like, you know, it's their, when they leave, if they have to leave Ethiopia, the first thing they miss is injera, you know. So this is the world we kind of we're kind of in. So I've kind of been talking a bit about conventional farming there a bit, but I'll go back a bit to the third leg of the chair: physics, chemistry, and the bit that's really missing was biology. Because conventional farms didn't, well, they do need the biology, everything needs the biology, but what happened was, because they were putting their chemicals in a liquid form, a soluble form, the plant has to suck up water to photosynthesize. So if the chemicals are in the water, it has to pull up the chemicals in it. So they weren't really looking at biology. It was war against nature, to kill biology, to kill funguses and pests and diseases, even birds. What are they? Starlings. They invented things to kill starlings and so basically it's just like I was saying about they want to control the health of things. They don't want birds here. They don't understand that this is an ecosystem, and that the birds and all the pests and everything that we perceive as being wrong are part of that ecosystem. And when you start to strip back that ecosystem and just have monocultures of things, this is when you end up with pandemics. 30 years ago, David Suzuki, I don't know if you've heard of David Suzuki, he's a climatologist, he's a soil scientist from Canada. They were talking back then that you can't fracture this connectiveness of everything without there not being results. There are going to be pandemics coming, And when you look at the effects of some of these, what was it called? Oh yeah, the COVID virus. And the connection to bats. Now, it's not the only one that's coming out of there. There's a massive viral thing came because after we found out about hydrogenated fats, and we decided we weren't going to have hydrogenated fats any longer, they were looking for a new type of oil or fat. So this is where we have the date palm oil industry take over in Indonesia or the whole area there, where they've basically gone into virgin rainforest and cleared the whole area and then built it with lines and rows of this palm oil. So there's one place in Indonesia, and they cut down the rainforest, which was the natural habitat of the flying fox, the fruit bat. So what happens is the whole of this fruit bat population takes off because they're coming in with bulldozers and everything. Go to Malaya, where they have massive pig farms, and they've learnt to grow mulberry trees so the pigs can eat off of the mulberries. But what happens is the bats then, they're stressed, and when they're stressed they shed their viral load, and it went into the pigs and also into this thing called toddy, which is what they make from the date palms, the date palm oil. And this has caused a COVID-like virus that they've known about for years now. That went through Asia and up into Bangladesh and was killing people because you've interrupted the ecosystem that was living there in symbiosis, and now all of these animals are stressed, and when they're stressed, they're producing more more viruses. And so this is just a little sign of what's been happening in the world. And because we live in our little bubbles, we can't get much news from our governments or whatever, But this is what's been actually happening out there, and loads of things, because I'm connected to growers around the planet. Loads of things been going on around the planet, because ecosystems have been destroyed. And it's only now when we're looking at the whole thing of biology that we realize, that 1 teaspoon of soil could have up to 10 million viruses in it, and you can't be separate from that environment any longer. Well, we were never separate from our ecosystem environments because we all do the same thing. We breathe in and we breathe out. Most of these organisms are in the air, we breathe them in and then we breathe our own stuff out, and that's why it kind of spreads so much, because For thousands of years we've been sharing our own biology with each other. Whenever we get into a room or whatever, or dancing or raving or whatever, we're spreading our own biology around, and that's part of our ecosystem. But again, if it's not in this thing called symbiosis, you have no balance in it. Things go too far out of kilter like this, and this is where the biology came into it. So now we're looking more at biology in the soil, but we don't take the biology away from the physics and the chemistry, because they're all mixed and interaround with each other. There's a fourth leg to the stool that we haven't quite built that leg yet. We've only been looking at quantum physics for a short while now, and it freaks us out. It even freaked out the little, what was his name? Einstein. Yeah, what did he say? Spooky actions at a distance. And that's what he called quantum physics, because he didn't like it because it was too weird. And is it a particle, or is it a wave? So there's that side of it where we're going to go into one day, but we're not there now. Everything is going to start going into quantum. Nothing happens without everything else happening. So when there's you've got the biochemical sequence. You've got a chemical sequence, but there's a biochemical sequence in farming, and that starts off with sulfur. Sulfur is the element that creates things. If you're doing an experiment and there's nothing going on, you add sulfur, things start to happen. So it's like the key in the ignition of life is sulfur. Now even sulfur's gone weird, because we were burning so much coal once upon a time. We had sulfur everywhere. We had light, it was coming out of the rain, coming down in the rain. But now we're finding that soils are having less sulfur in them, so there's less of that key of life going on there. And then what's the most important things in farming in the biochemical sequence is silica and boron. Now these two elements act together to create sap pressure. So the sap in trees, so it can defy gravity. It exchanges electrons and moves the sap up. And I've read of experiments they've done using radioactive isotopes, where they have a machine at the top of a big giant oak tree, say, and someone injects the isotope in at the root of the tree. The moment they inject it into the root of the tree, it registers at the top of the tree. And they haven't quite worked out what happens yet there. So there's a lot more going on out there. There's still mystery. We don't know everything that's going on out there. And one of the biggest mysteries is, if we were so clever, why wouldn't we just make our own photosynthesis machines? Why would we bother with plants? It's because it's so complex. It has things called the dark phase and the Shimamaki pathway and all these different processes. But basically what it is you take H2O, hydrogen, two molecules of hydrogen, one molecule of oxygen, and then you take CO2, one molecule of carbon and two molecules of oxygen, and then through this mysterious process of taking photons from the sun that plants can do using chloroplast, the leaves of the plant, they strip away the oxygen and they leave carbohydrates. Now carbohydrates are sugars, but it's not only a sugar, it's energy. So it's the main form of energy on this planet comes from the sun through plants. They're the highest trophic level. We are lower trophic creatures. We can't photosynthesize. We have to either eat an animal that's at a plant, or we have to eat a plant to get that energy into us. So that's what's going on. That's what I'm saying about if you have soluble fertilizers, the plant has to bring in water, H2O, to be able to photosynthesize. So now, instead of, I said the biochemical sequence, sulfur, silica, carbon, and then it's, not carbon, so silica and boron, and then it's calcium. So calcium is known as the truck. which you can load all of the elements on to get into the soil or into plants. But the truck can't go without the driver, and boron is the driver. So calcium's the truck, boron's the driver, and now potassium and other elements can come in once you've got that going. In conventional agriculture, where basically the forms of elements, say 10-10-20 is NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and kaolin, which is potassium. They're all going in liquid forms, and there's no control over it. They're just whatever goes in, and so that's why you get lush, rank growth. You get great growth, but that's why you then have to breed your wheat to be this big, because now if you left it the way that it had naturally evolved over hundreds of thousands of years, it's so sappy because of the nitrogen that's gone into it, it would lodge and they would fall over, and then the seeds would get damp and they wouldn't dry off properly, and you wouldn't have a crop. So that's what they did, is especially Norman Borlaug with his Green Revolution, they shrunk the height of the plants. Also, they'd stopped having animals on farms. They weren't mixed farms anymore. The speciality thing, so you specialized in one little bit of agriculture, and you have a polytunnel with 20,000 chickens in it, or a piggery with like hundreds of pigs in it, or acres and acres of one variety of wheat. And this was just like, if you're the thing that likes eating wheat, there's the place to go. You've got hundreds of acres of wheat. Oh yeah, no, I'm a pathogenic bacteria. I like attacking pigs. Well, pigs places where you want to go. So then they have to bring in medicines, and where's it all going? Where's it all funneling down to? Who is consuming, or apart from nature consuming everything? It's the humans. We're the ones who end up with it. We're the ones who consume all of this product from this conventional, financially based agriculture. And one of the worst things is that all of this was sold to us through our agricultural department, through our governments, because you don't want to be seen to be backward. You want to be up there with all the leaders in the world. Great little island, but you're poisoning your people, really. But that's okay, because if you were skeptical, you would say, well, that's funny that those companies producing the soluble ag chemicals are also the medical companies, and they're involved in arms and weapons as well, because I don't think it's so much that it's a conspiracy. I just think humans take advantage of things that they see. And so those advantages were taken hold of and gave them immense amounts of money and immense amounts of power to do things around the globe. So I'll ditch.
If you had your own small farm and you never did any of this, stuff, does it still infiltrate into the land, into the air, all that commercial?
Well, see, there's a certain percent. What we're trying to do in the soil is give the microorganisms the best possible chance for living and for metabolizing and everything. But one of the problems is we are basically, say there's a tsunami goes through here, or an earthquake or a volcano or something, and it clears the land of any vegetation. So the first things that happen on that land, cyanobacterias start to produce algae and things, and then lichens come in, which is a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and an algae, because the fungus can't photosynthesize, but the algae does. But the algae doesn't have the fungal acids to break down the rocks to get the minerals. So they come together. The algae photosynthesizes, and the fungi takes the minerals out of the rock, and they're lichens. And then gradually there's enough plant material grows that you get the higher plants start to come in. But it all has a progression. It progresses to climax woodland at the end. Climax woodland is the safest it keeps the temperatures, there's so many things going on in a big climax woodland. It supports a massive amount of diversity within it. But the bit that we're interested in is before it gets to the trees, when it's the grasslands. And that's where all our agricultural crops go. They go into a bacterially dominated soil because they have associations with bacteria on their roots. But the problem with that is we have been selecting weedy plants for maybe 10,000 years, 12,000 years. And it all comes from this thing with most agriculture that it started in ancient Greece, where they realized that the best plants grew in that loose soil. So we started taking varieties and putting them into loose soil. That set us up for the thing was, one day when we want to be bigger, we're going to have to create something to tear that soil up and make it disturb soil again. So our whole agriculture is based on this bacterially dominated, disturbed soil, which we've now come to the conclusion about is, well, we're destroying our planet as well with it. You know, every time we plow, you can see it. You can see it from space. You know, from the satellites from space, the amount of carbon we release and the amount of carbon we sequester every year. And it, you know, our year really starts to happen when spring's happening and plants come out. They start to suck in carbon dioxide and sequester it. But we also start to plough up all our fields. And when we plough up all our fields, we kill the biology and we release masses of carbon dioxide into the air because of this way that we've built on what we had before from these landslides and having little fields kind of thing. And the problem with that is we don't have fungi in the soil then. Because fungi is well, we know now, you know, the tiny little white hairs you see under a piece of rock or something when you pick it up, if there's fungi there, the hyphae, that's the brains of the land. It's intelligent. It can run for thousands of kilometers connected together. And you don't have that in a bacterially dominated soil. In fact, a guy called Walter Genet, who's from Australia, he's a fantastic guy. He's a climatologist and a soil scientist. He reckons before the First World War, we were all receiving our nutrition through the hyphae fungal network. Because plants they're connected to the hyphae through their roots, and they send chemical signals to each other. They talk. And so what I know, because I worked with apple trees, you know, they go dormant in the winter. They're not dead. They're just sleeping, dreaming of the next year, maybe. And as soon as the sun, so when they go to sleep, all of the biology around their roots goes to sleep as well, because it's winter. But when they start to wake up, they wake up first, and they start to, so most plants can secrete maybe 40-50% of the sugars that they make from photosynthesis into the soil to support the microorganisms around their roots. It's called the rhizosphere around their roots. Well, what they do is they'll wake up and they'll give a little bit of sugar down there, and then the hyphae wake up, the fungus, and they talk to each other, and the fungus will go, give us some more of that sugar. And then the apple tree will send these signals saying, well, I'll give you some more sugar, but first of all, I want some water, a touch of potassium, and maybe some magnesium as well while you're there. And so the fungi just sends these signals out, brings these elements back to the rhizosphere to feed the plant, and the plant feeds it sugars. So we're not getting that anymore. We don't get this conversation between the plants and the microorganisms. And like I was saying, science keeps moving on, and we've just discovered this thing called quorum sensing. Quorum sensing is how microorganisms talk to each other. And what it came about was Dr. Elaine Ingham, she's a soil scientist from Oregon State, before she opposed Monsanto and got chucked out. But it didn't matter, because she created this thing called the soil food web. And but she was making these compost teas. I don't know if you've ever heard of compost teas, where you can take compost and you bubble air through it, and you give it a touch of molasses for sugar, and you breed a load of bacteria and then you tip it on your soil, and that improves the bacteria in your soil. That's not the way it works at all. Elaine Ingham. It's not the way it works at all now. Now we know through quorum sensing, we have native biology here. It's been here a long time, a lot of it. It's well used to the habitat that it's in. If you tip a foreign bacteria or whatever onto it, it'll take it out instantly. It can't be there. It's not strong enough. You know, these guys are adapted to being here. But in the liquid that bacteria and fungus and protozoas and amoebas and flagellates and ciliates and all the other microorganisms living in it, the liquid has a biochemical language to it. And it's that liquid, when you pour those teas onto the soil, that talks to the indigenous biology that's there and says, come on, pick yourself up, here's some sugar and whatever. And so then you get a response from your soil because you've just fed it with this big biochemical signaling. It's you've told it, come on, here's some food, summer's here, let's get going. And we've only just found that out, and now they're finding out more and more because it's organisms, microorganisms talking to each other. They've found them kind of with, I think it's TB. No, it wasn't TB. Pneumonia, maybe. Something like that. They've found this quorum sensing going on in humans. You know, so one of the interesting things that's just come about with this Omicron thing is that the first waves of the COVID that we were getting, especially the Delta, was just, you know, it's a parasite, but we're loaded with them. In fact, we probably wouldn't be who we are without viruses. They've affected us mutagenically and everything over the time that we've been here. So the first ones, the Delta and whatever came through, they killed us. They were strong viruses, you know. This is the way it goes. But then eventually you get a virus more like Omicron that is, you know, they're parasites. Why would you kill your host? It's a bit like us destroying the planet. Why would you do it? Where are you going to live? And it's the same with viruses as well. It's like, or any parasites, or, you know, why would you kill the organism that you're in? Unless you made a big mistake by attacking an organism that was already ill. And so they reckon what happens is that there's this trajectory normally with pandemics and things like this. Eventually they become more like the colds and flus that we have. We build up a bit resistance. They have a bit of, you know, they don't attack us as much so that they get to live with us. And this is all done through quorum sensing. This complex biochemical sequencing that's going on all around us all the time. You know. And when we look at plants now as biological farmers, we don't just look at the plant. We look at the rhizosphere, which is the roots, the phyllosphere, which is the leaves. You know, we look at the whole plant as an organism, just like we're made up of loads of different organisms, but you know, we're a multicellular organism, and so is the plant. So we have foliar sprays now that we'll use to spray on plants to stimulate the good bacteria and funguses and things that are growing on them to outcompete pathogens when they're stressed, because the environment that they're living in is stressing them, and that gives a chance for pathogens to get in and attack them. When we look at bacteria, they're very good at sucking up, well, what they like is simple sugars. They love breaking down simple sugars. So the other things, which are lignans and hard compounds to break down, funguses have adapted to break those down. So bacteria are mainly alkaline and funguses are mainly acids. Now funguses are that clever that they always stay in association with bacteria. They don't, you know, they don't kill the bacteria so much. So a fungal hyphae will be going through the ground and absorbing nutrients, and it'll hit something that it won't be able to get through. It then starts to secrete these quorum sensing things, and it draws in all these other bacterias. The bacterias eat the thing that the fungus couldn't get through, and they get rewarded for it, and then the fungus carries on. And also fungus, the hyphae, they're so thin, the strands are microscopic strands, but what they'll do is they'll of hyphae around a bit of soil, and they'll squeeze the oxygen out of it, because oxygen's the burner. It's it burns everything. It's the light, light something. If there's oxygen there, it will burn. So what they do by squeezing the oxygen out of it, they allow these organisms in there to not burn up the nutrients that the hyphae, that the fungus is after. So they're clever enough yolks. They really are. There's 3 types of funguses as well. And what really gets me is I'm 64, and when I was 7, 8 years old, we used to go out on the farm fields where I lived in England every late summer, autumn, and pick mushrooms. They were everywhere. I don't see a single mushroom on farms any longer. So you've got none of that activity that I was talking about going on. So that's, when I talk about a fractured, damaged ecosystem, you can see how that ecosystem is already failing if it doesn't have the funguses there. So.
Can I stop you there, because you've been getting a huge amount of information. I'm just wondering, would you
Yeah.
find out for just any questions there? I just find it all so informative, just any, there's so much there.
It's just a story.
Yeah. Does anybody any questions? Or is it all too much?
It's all too much. It's just a.
Few years ago, I was in Malawi, and I was going up the mountain, and the women were sitting there with bananas. Now, we always bought the bananas green in the market.
Yeah.
And I said to my friend, what are they doing? He said, no, they're making them yellow. And where do they get the stuff? In the hardware shop.
Yeah.
You see?
Yeah.
It's really, that was in the mountain, in the middle of nowhere.
Well, that's part of this whole thing of culinary colonialism, where somebody else is imposing the way things should be on the way that the people had always done things there. That it's a massive great thing, and it's not countries now, it's corporations, and like what they've done in India, what they did with BT cotton in India. They've spent literally trillions on GM technology, trillions and trillions of it. They've invented 2 things from it. One is to make your plants Roundup resistant, so now you can spray Roundup everywhere and it doesn't kill your plant. The other thing was BT cotton. It comes from a bacteria from southern Germany called Bacterium thuringiensis. And what that does is they realise that BT, it used to be used in organic. This bacteria attacks caterpillars and leaf worms and things like that. So what they did is they extracted DNA from it and then pumped that into the cotton, but it didn't work well. So millions of farmers in northern India, and the seeds were really expensive. They bought these BT cotton seeds. You have to buy the chemicals that go with it. And then what happened was the yields weren't good. Microorganisms and insects normally have much faster life cycles than we do, so they're able to breed in resistance really quickly. And you get this, they then become resistant to the poison or whatever you're trying to use on them. And so what happened then, because the yields were so bad on the cotton, and that the farmer, the whole family would have had to take the debt on, because they were expecting to get a yield, a harvest, and that would pay for the seeds that they'd bought. They got to the end, there's no harvest. Now they don't have the money to pay for the seeds. So what the men did, rather than the family take on the whole of the debt, the men committed suicide. Thousands and thousands of farmers in India committed suicide by drinking the poison that they were supposed to spray on Roundup, the chemicals. That's what happens in a system where you imperialize the thing. You bring it in and say, well, your product is, you know, it's like what they did in the 60s, and I don't know about Ireland, but they did it in the UK. We lost all of our beautiful pine tables because Formica was the in thing to have. Formica tables and Formica chairs and everything. It's the like a, you know, it's the next best thing. But what they did in India was diabolical, absolutely diabolical. And they haven't, well, what it did do in India is it started a grassroots movement, and Vandana Shiva and others, kind of the Chipka movement up in the north, and the ladies are doing it. So you've got to understand that there are more people not doing the type of agriculture that we have here in the rest of the world than there is doing what we've got here. And another thing that's different from here is there's a, you know, like I was talking about the sacredness of things, there's a cultural dance that the people, the farmers have. So you might have the fact that, you know, the Hopis, the men will go out and they will plough, but they don't have the seeds. The women have the seeds, and then the women give them the seeds when it's time for them to go in the ground. They don't trust them with them up to that, and then the men plant the corn, the maize, and the squash and the beans that they grow, and then when it's harvest time, both lots come out and they harvest, and then the women have it. It disappears from the men again and goes into the women's hut or the women's kiva, or wherever they're going to keep the grains.
Seems that we lost our culture there.
Sorry?
We lost our culture.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, and that's the same thing in the rest of the world. There's big, massive agricultural movements. You've got La Via Campesina, which is the Peasants' March, which is the biggest agricultural union in the world now, being driven by women. You know, they were the main agriculturists. Men, well, we were together. We weren't separated. There wasn't men and there wasn't all women. There was just us trying to do our best to survive. You know, there was no real patriarchy or whatever that was above us all. You know, the majority of us were all striving to just survive in our world. But it's starting to happen now, and it really, I love it. It infuses me because there's a group now called the UK and Ireland Seed Sovereignty Group. We're training people to become seed savers and whatever, and each area has their own kind of the person, an instructor, leader of it, and in the UK most of them are young women that are doing it, and they're really passionate about what they're doing. You know, so we can see the way things have kind of been manipulated through our agriculture, but the most important thing is it's us that's responsible. You create the world where you spend the money. If you want a world of biological or organic or whatever, you seek out those people and you pay them for their food and for their work. You know, if you want it to be chemically laden, whatever, or hydroponic, you buy your food from that source. But it's us really who's responsible for what's going on around the world. We just don't think we have the power because we're all individual little people kind of thing. You know?
It's just between of, and I said we lost our culture, a lot of culture was lost there.
Yeah.
But I don't often, and I hate it. I hate it when you put culture that is forgotten and got replaced by politics, let's say.
Yeah.
I look in Austria, where I'm from, and I think farming, thankfully, has again in Austria really top, like amazing. All the old farmers have solar panels on their houses now, and really great. We call it Abholverkauf. It's when you sell your goods in your courtyard.
Beautiful,
there's no traveling involved. There's no. It's really coming and booming. What my problem there is a little bit. It is this. It's in. It's this. This is the time. And you talked about it a little bit. Volunteers. It's this like. I hate it because it's this new coat. This like passion. Thank you. Yeah. And I try to resist to not disliking it, but there's still something with me. There's still the culture or that spirit still is forgotten to some degree. So where's the balance? Do I have to let go of that, or how can I find my peace with this? You know, I don't see it so much in Ireland yet. I think it might come as well. I always at some point keeps up, you know. I find it interesting how this
is imbalance right now. At least in Austria, I think in Germany it's happening a bit as well, and
Yeah.
in the north of Italy, I think.
Well, even the COVID has changed things. It woke people up a bit. You know, all of a sudden they were not sitting in an office at work. Well, not everybody sits in an office at work, but you were seeing nature and you're, you know, and becoming aware of things. And a lot of people also started being aware of food. You know, because a lot of the time, if you're caught in that thing where you're running, food's just a utility you stick in yourself, you know, to keep you going, kind of thing. But when you had time to stop and cook and realise that's culture. To cook and sit around a meal together and break bread with each other. These are really ancient things, you know, and it could happen. It's just us to make it happen. I don't mean us as in us here. I mean us as in the humans on the planet. We have to know that we have power. Our power is in our pocket, you know, where we spend our money. If we want to keep buying bleach, then your rivers are going to be full of bleach. You know what I mean? It's that simple, really. You know, it's easy as you get older, though. It's not easy when you're young. It's easy as you get older. So.
I think there is a need to have election. I think even the kids in school have election. The education is different now. You know, because there's a lot more.
But there's no opportunities for them to get into alternative agriculture.
No, but at least it's a start. You know.
Yeah.
But what is depressing, I find, sorry, just keep on with the depressing stuff, is that is true. I see as well my children and the kids around here, and as well kids of friends in Austria and so on. There's definitely some movement. But I'm so sad to say it does matter. Of course it does.
Especially with
But there are fucking big people out there who do not give a crap, and to be honest, that has changed. Like, you know. It's lovely and good that we are doing our part, absolutely, and as much as we can, and as longer we do it, as better we get at it, and as more we learn, because we cannot change it one way or the other. It's not possible, sadly, even if it's but there's the big people out there that I don't know.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Kevin.
Pardon?
Yeah, I was going to say that it's a long time, I think, since I've been so keen as I was when you were talking about Anglo-Saxon words for the soil, about the fact that we speak our colonizers' language. We don't speak our own language.
Exactly.
Why isn't it you're telling us the Gaelic words for soil?
Exactly.
And of course, that's more
Beol.
than just a sort of a quaint remembrance of what we've lost.
It
It
is.
is the absolutely essential origins of the knowledge of our soil, of our planet, of our plants over millennia.
Yeah.
And it's embodied in the language, it's embodied in
Yeah.
the folklore, that awful word in English,
Yeah.
which belittles this source of knowledge.
Yeah.
Béal Idis, as we call it in Irish, which is the knowledge that people carry in their own culture,
Yeah.
in their voice, in their storytelling. And this is at the heart of the way in which we in Gaelic culture have maintained our store of knowledge, and yet, you know, we treat it as if it's folklore, it's of no importance, but it's replete with knowledge about locality, about place.
Yeah.
And you know, I don't think we'll ever in Ireland be able to really embrace biodiversity without going back to speaking, not just getting access through translation, to speaking our own absolutely deeply nature-based language. I mean, it's a language which experts acknowledge internationally is unique in its sensitivity to nature.
Yeah.
And yet we just treat it as if it's of no importance. It
No.
pains me.
Yeah,
My
I can understand that totally. Yeah, I can understand it totally, because it's every colonized country that happens in, you know, and then there's new colonizations going on all the time. Smashed avocado on toast, you know. That's well, a couple of years ago that was the meme anyway. Smashed avocado, until we found out that the mafia was controlling the water in Central South America where all the avocados were being built. Yeah, there's something that needs addressing. I mean, you know, that's why we call Talamh Beol. You know, and the land and the language. Well, the language comes through the people from the land. You know, and it always amazed me. Like I love the vernacular. When you go to different areas, the sounds, and I try to look at the land and see if I can see the the sounds of the voices in the land, you know, where it's really rocky, you have these kind of sounds coming because it's the rocks, you know, sound. Whereas when the land is more mediated, it becomes kind of more softer and more like Kerry Cork, although that's Saxon, Viking really, in it. Yeah, no, but it's something I've not only pondered on, I've read a lot about as well. I've been reading a lot of a guy called Gary Paul Naban. He's an ethnobotanist, and he sees it everywhere he goes. But when you go back, it's so fluid, you know. There was people who lived above Yemen in Arabia there for over 2,000 years because a group of them had started to understand hydrology, and they'd built a dam, and it went on for 2,000 odd years until the dam burst because they'd forgotten there was a dam there. Up to 2000, the Po Valley, Vavilov went through the Po Valley in the 1920s, 30s. He was blown away by the Po Valley. The Po Valley is a disaster now. You know, Milan has put hydroelectric dams on it and everything. You know, everywhere he went, he saw fruit trees married to vines that grew up through the fruit trees, and then salads growing under the trees, and then small fields between the trees with fava beans or wheat or things like that. I mean, you're talking about agroecology. And now we're reinventing the wheel again with, you know, our government's not that interested in agroecology, you know, because they still can't get out of this commercial, financial kind of thing that we're in. Yeah, yeah. Well, that's what our schools teach us, you know. Yeah.
So what does agroecology look like on the ground? You know,
It's very hard to see it in any farm. The nearest farm I would see it on would be Thomas O'Connor's down in Dingle, where Thomas is diverse, not just in his plant but in his animals as well, and he's big into mycology. So and always working. See, agroecology really came out of peasant agriculture, and it was mainly at the beginning, I think it was Miguel Altieri and a guy called Stephen Glissman. They termed the agroecology. They made the term agroecology. But what they saw was they were driving down from California down to Mexico every year, and they'd be driving down, and they'd drive past this place, and it was kind of jungle, you know, overgrown kind of jungle. And then one time they drove past it, and there was these guys harvesting it with a machete. And so they stopped to start talking to these guys, and they said, oh yeah, we're just harvesting our fields, our farm. And he said, but it's forest. No, it's not. Like, you know, this is how our fathers taught us to farm. This is how our grandfathers taught us to farm. And so when you looked into it, it wasn't just jungle, it was an agroecological system that was there. And it basically, they just went in with a machete a couple of times a year, harvested the food and took it off, kind of. And this is where agroecology really means. It means using our intelligence to try to get back to some kind of polycultures. So that's machines start to disappear when you get into polycultures, because they're not adept, well, until they start producing the robots anyway. They're not adept enough of going in and picking and recognizing the different fruits and things in there. Machines just clear the whole thing in kind of, you know, like combines and whatever. So, yeah, it would look a bit like the Po Valley there, with, you know, this complexity. Or,
like an individual farm, if they wanted to try to really do the best, what would that look like?
They'd have to break it up like mad. Break it up. No big fields. No bare soil. Bare soil is bad. Andalusia, about 500 years ago, when the Moors were there, that was like, we're a long way back from them, what they were doing. You know, the first thing they did was they they got all of the peoples together. They got the Jews and the Muslims and the Christians and whoever else was there together, and they got all of the old Roman agricultural treaties translated so that everybody could understand them. And then they had debates. They had big debates about food. Every farm had a research piece to it. It was called a almu something or other in Arabic, Spanish, or whatever it was then. And the whole culture just took off because it permeated through everything. The cooking, how you had meals as well. How you like, the worst thing I've ever seen is I was at the Pilltown, South Kilkenny agricultural show one year, and our expression of that was a chipper. A massive, great, stinking chipper. That was the kind of food that was being served there. Where I was lucky enough to go to Andalusia, to a seed conference there, and God, it was about all the foods, the fantastic chickens that they have, Andalusian chickens, and they had their top chefs there and cooking all these traditional foods. We'd be hard pushed to do that now here. There's people like PJ McMahon in Galway. He's re-establishing an Irish culinary thing. He doesn't use anything from outside the country. It's all grown here or harvested here. So he gets into problems when he can't use black pepper because we don't grow it here. So they just use the leaves of leeks. They they dry them in the ovens and then char them slightly and then grind them, and they use that as black pepper. It's the nearest they can get to it, you know. But it's that. And see, it's changing also in culinary things like France really dominated our culinary world, you know, with the cuisine. And it was the guys in Scandinavia who clocked this on first. They were saying, why are we making French meals here? We're Norwegian, we're Swedish. There's fish, loads of plants. And so now they created a whole cultural thing with foods coming from Scandinavia where they are. And PJ McMahon, or is it McMahon, I think it is, he's doing the same thing up in Galway.
What does it do for oil?
We have our own oils here. We use rapeseed oil here. Yeah, there's loads of oils we can have here. Some, you know, maybe sunflower oil even. But see, we didn't have oils here. We had fats. It was different, like, you know. And so fat was valued. You know, it was valued for, you know, when you had a pig and you roasted it, you saved the fat and you let it go and had a brush in it, and every time you had a fried egg or something, you brush it with the fat of the pig. We've lost all of that.
I miss that so much.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and apparently it's the best for baking savoury dishes as well, you know, pig fat. We don't know any of that any longer. We don't know. But in a way it's because this word of improvement has been used. This illusion that this is more efficient. That's one of the words they use. This is more efficient. But people who are coming up with a statement don't know the efficiency of the thing that they're talking about. Because when you talk about things in nature, they're more than just the visual, physical thing you see. You know, the way they interact. It's like saying, trees, they're a bit in the way. We should cut them all down. Get them out of the way. I can't see over the hill there. Yeah, but they also produce oxygen. We don't need oxygen. What is oxygen? You know, it's that. It's so microscopic, the world, really. You know, and us big naked monkeys bumbling around thinking that we know better than nature was our first real problem, I think. And I think that is bound into some kind of spirituality as well. A loss of spirituality, a loss of connectedness to life. Because, you know, life attracts life. If you want things to grow, plant things. And other things will come. That's life. Life connects life. So I'll just fire through these different forms of farming. So what I've been talking about with the soluble chemicals is conventional farming. It's the main one where you get all your grants, you get your CAP, you get all of these things coming in. It's producing most of the food. It's not best for our environment, our ecosystem. ourselves or any of the plants or animals that we're because again, like Pat has said, it's financial and economic that they're looking at, the yield that they can extract, not what's left after the yield or what's happening while the yield is being produced, kind of thing. And then you've got organic. Well, organic is basically a group of people who they saw that the chemicals that were being used were wrong. And so they said, right, we want to farm without using chemicals. We're going to call it organic. Now, organic means any carbon-based life form, really. But they had to have a name for it, really. And it came out of the work of Albert Howard and Lady Eve Balfour over here. And in the States, there is, what are they called? Begins with R. Can't remember. Anyway, but there was a group working over in the States, and it kind of has come on from there. But today, it really just means that you get a stamp. I think I just broke something in there. You get a stamp which tells people you're organic. So really, it's like a trust issue. You know, they come round, they inspect you, and they give you a stamp, and that tells the rest of the consumers out there that you're not using any chemicals. It's no sign of nutrient density. This was one of the big issues we had, was when we started using refractometers to look at the amount of nutrient density in plants. Organic produce is just as bad and sometimes worse than conventional food. Okay, it doesn't have any of the sides on it, fungicides, herbicides, pesticides, all of that. You know, it's cleaner, and there's a much more, you could say, sustainable way of growing things. Your understanding of rotations and of green manures and things is much more, but it's going to that economic thing, you know, the economic and financial thing. So at that time as well, everybody was talking about sustainables, that we're going to be sustainable, but now we don't use the word sustainable really anymore. We use the word regenerative, because there's very little to sustain. We need to regenerate. We need to regenerate the land. We need to regenerate our food systems. We need to regenerate everything almost in our society that we have got feeling that isn't kind of working, and we don't have any control over it. So that's where the regenerative agriculture comes from, and it comes from the work of Alan Savory. Alan Savory was he was in something to do with the British Empire in Africa, and he was one of the guys looking after one of the big game reserves. And then he got a report from the scientists, the ecological scientists, the place is being destroyed. It's the elephants that are doing it. They're destroying the place. So it was him. He didn't like doing it, but that was what he had to do. They had a massive cull of elephants. They killed hundreds of them. And it really was, you know, something he had to carry for the rest of his life. He still carries it. But from that, he started discovering things, because they found when they killed the elephants, it got worse. So what he found was that, especially in dry land areas, if the animals aren't there to it doesn't touch the ground. And so if it doesn't touch the ground, it doesn't decay and become humus eventually. It just stays as dead, dry grasses and things. So Alan Savory and quite a few other people have developed these mob grazing techniques, where you bring a lot of cattle into a small area of grass, and you activate the instinct in the wild cow to mob, because the wolves and the lions are on the outside, and so they mob together. And when they're mobbing, they'll eat like mad, and what they don't eat, they'll pee and poo on, and they'll squash it all back down and fertilize the field. It's the farmer's duty to pay attention to the mob, because he has to move that on. He might leave it in a field for 2 hours or 2 days, depending on the amount of material that has to be knocked down and eaten. Because in our farming system, we have a big field, we let a lot of cows in it. The cows only eat the bits that they want, they don't eat anything else, so it just stays up there, and eventually they have to plough the field and reseed it, because the plants that have done well in that field are the ones that the cows haven't eaten, and they've gone back to seeds of thistles and docks and things like that. So mob grazing is really taken off, and they're regenerating soil. You know, we were told, oh, it takes thousands of years or whatever to generate an inch or two of soil, whereas these guys are really maxing the amount of soil that they're building in their farms. There's a guy in the States called Gabe Brown. He's big into the whole mob grazing thing as well, and it's really taken off. And you know, one of the surfing guys over in Lahinch, Moy Hill, he's big into it, and he doesn't have his own cows. He looks after his neighbour's cows and mob grazes his land with them. So you know, that's regenerative agriculture. And then in between that all, you have biological agriculture, which is basically the guys who are organic and regenerative, who are saying, look, you know, we don't want to be organic, because number one, why should we pay money to be organic when conventional farms who use chemicals don't pay anything for being conventional farms? So they're biological, they're deeper than organic. They're that bit deeper than organic. They're really understanding of biological systems, plants, genetics. It's that whole umbrella of agriculture.
They're still trying to generate, you know, regenerate the land through plants and through what they plant.
That's what they do, yeah, because biological would also cover the whole thing of agroecology and syntropic agroforestry, all of these things. They're regenerating the land. They're in a biological sense. So I've kind of explained a bit what agroecology is, and then there's agroforestry, which is a really old practice in Europe, really old. And there was a guy who just moved from, he was up on the Swiss border somewhere, and that's what his family had always done. And he moved to Brazil, where the place was being trashed. But it meant that he could buy a big lump of trashed land. And now, a few years ago, they managed to send a drone up when we started getting drones, and you wouldn't know that it wasn't forest. It looks like the Amazonian rainforest, but it's his farm. And so the whole thing of syntropic agroforestry is that the whole is more than the parts. Yeah? So all of the parts that make up that syntropic agroforestry system don't make up the whole. There's more there. So what you do is you allow, so they grow bananas in there, so they'll have rows of trees, yeah, forestry trees, and in between they'll be growing vegetables and things, and they grow lots of bananas, because bananas are easy to propagate apparently, and they produce loads of biomass. And so you can imagine in the Amazon, with if you have some moisture and you have all that sunshine, the thing is, and so they're constantly doing this thing called chop and drop. So you chop down certain plants, you prune certain things, and you leave that material underneath, and then that's broken down by the biology, and then that becomes more and more fertile, and again you're building soil that way. And it's fantastic what they've done. It really is. Again, it has to be tweaked to where it is, that place-based, where you're going to do that agriculture. Because it's like, have you heard of the Three Sisters? It's an American first, and it's maize, beans, climbing beans, and squash, and they have these three. I've never seen anybody do it except in California, because we don't have the genetics for it. These people have been working on these three plants for thousands of years, and what people do is they plant their squash, because you know the squash has got big leaves, so it can photosynthesize at a lower level than you get that sunshine down there. But if the squash grows faster than your maize or your beans, all you've got is squash. You know, so it wasn't that they had three different things. They had three different species that were like a multi-line. They were connected together. You know, they were connected in a certain way, and that's how they grew. So talking about it is like, oh yeah, the Three Sisters. What do you use? Oh, you use maize, beans, and squash. It sounds simple, but it's not when you burrow down into it. Like, you know, and it's the same with a lot of our systems here. We are a land of cabbages. It is the brassicas are the plants that love it here. You know, And you can say, oh, I don't like brassicas. Have you ever tasted the whole of the brassica genome? We lost 90% of all our agricultural crops by the year 1900. 90% of it. So 90% of all of the food that was there before is gone. But we still have a lot. And what we need to do now is create more plant breeders so that we can have whatever flavours, size, taste, texture, crunch, time of the year, plants that fit into our ecosystem, our agricultural ecosystem here. Because where do we go? Do we farm in an ecosystem, or do we have an ecosystem that fits into a farming system? You know, we know the direction we want to go, but we're all held back by money. And so what do you have to do? You have to get a grant, and you have to get this. But my dad, rest his soul, there's no such thing as a free meal, which is a bit. There is such thing as a free meal. You just got to find nice people. but you know, that whole thing with grants is normally you've got to give something back if you're taking something away. I think we're such a wealthy society that I think we should start waking up again to that world that we want to be, and start putting our intent and what little money we have together to create the world we want to be. I always thought that Cloughjordan, you know, if we could have a fund, a community fund, where we could send young people off down to Ballymaloe and learn from Dorina Allen and whatever, all about, you know, the culinary things, and bring them back here. We could have a culinary school here. You know, if we could send our farmers off to the top farmers and producers and bring them back here, we'd have the same thing. Do you know what I mean? Because it's all there. It's whether we can make it happen. And we're not poor. Even the poor of us isn't poor. When you've been to third world countries, like, you know, that's real poor. And they're happy people, a lot of them. They're poor, but they're happy. Whereas here, I remember once talking to a Buddhist monk who came here, and he couldn't for the life of him understand why, you know, all the people he met here, they were so miserable and stressed. All the money they had. But after a while, he did realise that it was the system that people were in, you know, and that they felt that system through themselves, and that's how it came out. Where he wasn't seeing that in poor people; they were just poor. You know, they didn't have the same kind of mental problems that we have in our system. You know, their main thing was getting enough food to see them through the day. They were living in the moment, kind of thing. You know.
But the very concept of poverty itself is a creation of industrial society.
Yeah. Well, you have to create a polarisation anyway.
They never talked about the rich and the poor. They talked about the aristocrats who had power.
Yeah, yeah.
But they didn't see themselves as inferior in some way.
Yeah.
This whole language we use about rich and poor is so
Yeah.
suspect.
Well, the psychology of it is that we all aspire to be like them. Then, you know, if we're from poor, I remember going to Kilkenny Cat Laughs, and David McWilliams was there, and he said, "Geez, the front room." He said the front room in our house, nobody went in the front room. Only the priest went in the front room, or the doctor, or whatever, went into the front room, like, you know. And he said he links that to colonisation. That was the room where you aspired to be better than you were. And that's why we had whole generations of Irish people trying to become entrepreneurs and be, you know, we want to be like the British or the Americans or whatever. When what's wrong with being feckin' Irish? Like, you know, you start to lose your individuality, your vernacularism, like, you know, oh, don't speak like that, that's not right, you need to speak like this. And that's diversity. You can't have biological diversity without cultural diversity as well. It's just...
Linguistic diversity.
Yeah, and the sense is racism is nonsense genetically, because you end up with inbreeding depression. You know what I mean? Oh, we don't go anywhere near them. Well, yeah, but like, you know, all our kids are kind of having birth defects because we're, you know, married to my sister and mother, and you know, all of this kind of stuff. We know that when we get that heterozygousness going, you know, like the Maoris, when the Maoris met the Irish in New Zealand, because the Irish were there to escape the British in Australia, like, you know, and when those guys, those two kind of races came together. The offspring from them were really good looking, fit, big people kind of, you're reintroducing some genetic diversity within us. So, racism's nonsense. I can understand that we come from a past where we were little groups and it was always the outside to be frightened of, but, we have Google now. So, there you go. So,
has your thinking changed a lot in the last few years? Like, say 5 years ago in the farm, would you be saying the same thing as you're saying today around biology and agroecology?
No, well, it's gradually expanding. We have the Biofarm conference every year. Yeah. It's been going for about 4 years now, which has changed everything. Because now Knott's actually doing the education for the organic sector. And when they do Biofarm, they ask the farmers, is there anybody you'd like to see? And so we've been bringing in people from America and New Zealand and Australia and all over Europe and the UK to these conferences so that we can lift ourselves up, kind of, I watched the Eco-Eye, by the way, and the one with Duncan was going to the farming thing, and where he was at Chagas, where they have these plots and they have the mixed sward. We've known about that for 30 years. There's no goal. Look what we've done. No, you get more yield from a mixed sward crop kind of thing. I don't think they're still saying that you shouldn't use nitrogen on it. Although now with the thing going on with Russia and Ukraine, you're not going to have the nitrogen. It's gone from 300 odd euros a ton up to 900 euros a ton. So conventional farmers are going to be stuck. And then if we're talking about multi-sward species, who's got the seeds? Where are the seeds? Nobody in Ireland that I know who's saving multi-sward seed species to sell, which means you've got to go to the UK, which means you've got Brexit, or you've got to go to the mainland Europe, which has got its own problems. Because if you're a big conventional grower, especially in France, and most big farms that there are, they insure their crops. Well, now the insurers are dictating what crops they grow, whether it's some kind of technology being used on it or not. So the farmer, he has to do that to insure his crop, because otherwise if there's a flood or whatever, he doesn't get no return. But that's the whole idea of the CSA model, was that your community is not separate from you at all. It is you. And that your community support you in whatever happens on the farm. Whatever ecological situations happen, they are there to make sure that the food supply keeps flowing, and really, you should be breeding your own children back into it as well, But anyway, so the last one is biodynamics. It's a hard one, biodynamics, because it came about 100 years ago now, in what is now Poland, but was Germany at the time. A philosopher called Rudolf Steiner, who had a deep, mysterious understanding of everything, almost. But see, he had grown up in his earlier life in Austria with peasant people. So he knew about the land, and he knew about culture, and he knew, it's a bit like Muhammad. When Muhammad started to create Islam, he took the taxes away from the spice fairs, and most people were involved in spice, because he said, if we're all Muslims, why should I be charging you? And that's one of the reasons that Islam took off in all the poor areas before they had their kind of religious wars. Was there was an understanding that this is unfair, this is unjust, kind of thing, So this is what Steiner was seeing as well at deep levels, this is wrong. And he was called to a place called Kobowitz in Now he only gave one series of agricultural lectures, because he was supposed to have another one, but he died. So we only got half the story, and we've been trying to pick our way through it since, because he uses kind of an esoteric language to explain it. So he'll be talking about the etheric forces and astral forces and things like that. And we've changed in time. if anything, for most people, it means, woo, you know, oh, he's a bit of a hippie. But it wasn't based on that at all. It was based on something much more solid. The history of the people of Europe was basically what it was. And they were called to this farm because it was after the war and things had started going wrong. They had had an agricultural system going for maybe 100 years and it stopped working. The animals were becoming infertile. They could grow crops on a field for maybe 6 years. Now they could only get 2 years out of it before it failed. And so they started to look at this whole thing of what was happening. And it was what was coming from the war. They were starting to use these ag chems, the technology in it, the tanks. They went into tractors. So tanks were, you know, they had the whole Ford's supply line set up. They just tweaked it a bit. And so the first tractors were Caterpillar tractors like the tanks. And then gradually they evolved it from that. So all of the agriculture was being run from the military waste, really. And he set up this whole thing called the biodynamic circle, where he gave advice to farmers and meditations. Take this meditation away, meditate on it, think about it, go into it deeper and deeper. So they developed this biodynamic principle. A lot of it is to do with interacting with biological compounds, you know, microorganisms, amino acids, enzymes, things like this. But that wasn't called that at the time. So with biodynamics, you don't use any chemicals on the land. You try to look at having the farm as a closed system. You always have animals in the system. And you have a certain amount of these preparations that are made, and all of the preparations were made from products on the farm. So it was a closed system. It didn't need to, like others since Steiner have realised, farmers are caught by the short and curlies really, because they don't control their system. All the inputs that are coming in that they have to buy affects the harvest at the end of the season. To pay for those inputs, you know, so the biodynamic system was set up to run itself. Could you set up an ecology that you would gain enough depth into the mysteries of what was happening out there to keep this happy life energy going on and feed the people the highest quality life energy that you could get. You know, it was about, the way they saw it was life energy, not even vitamin B12 or vitamin A or K or whatever. It was more about this life energy, giving people the food that you can see it in strong people. You can see it in strong people's eyes, you know, not just in the way they stand in their bodies. You can see kind of this integral health that's in people. And so but the Nazis hated it. They didn't like it at all. Hitler was attacked by the Nazi party, and he then died in mysterious circumstances. And then what always happens when you have a leader and they die, everybody starts arguing. You know, my form of dynamics is biodynamics is the same in Buddhism, the same as in all religions, kind of thing. You know, it's just this human thing. So now we're just coming back out of that now. It was kept alive mainly by the Camp Hill communities throughout the world, but they've since been attacked here by the HS Hikwa or whatever they want to call it now. It's not an Irish word, is it? Hikwa? Is it an Irish word?
Oh no, it's not.
So, and so the Camp Hills are disappearing now. But what came out of it eventually was a guy we had in Ireland who's passed away now. He was from America, called Hugh Lovell, and Hugh was very deep into biodynamics, very deep into it, but a very practical man as well. And he started looking into it and developing this thing called quantum agriculture. So he wrote a book called Quantum Agriculture Beyond Biodynamics. And in this, he starts to look at the whole thing of quantum and how quantum plays out, and how the quantum field is, we're all playing into that quantum field. It's everything. It's everything here. Everything living. Every little corner is part of the field, and we're all part of the field. So we're all connected, and everything's connected. And how do you develop things on from that agriculturally and ecologically? So that's kind of where biodynamics has gone. A lot of the guys, there's a mixture of animal and herbal preparations that you make. Now we have a lot of people, because of we're affluent, who are vegetarians or whatever they want to be, kind of thing. Whereas at that time, you lived on a farm, there was animals, the animals had to be slaughtered. You might as well make use of the parts of the animal that you're not eating to bring so I'll tell you one of them. One of them is intestines stuffed with soaked chamomile. And you make little sausages and you bury this for 6 months. And then when you dig it back up again, it's turned into soil. There's the two main preparations. There's preparation 500 is a cow horn with a cow that has to have so many lactations, and then cow dung from a cow that is eating hay. So there's a good mixture. We did have it, yeah, we did, yeah. And then that's buried for a whole year, where it's the cosmic energy comes into the earth and then back out of the earth, and it soaks up this energy and it turns into this. It's not cow shit when it comes out. It's like a putty. It's like putty, kind of a bit shiny. And then there's another one called preparation 501, and what that is, it's ground up quartz crystal that's made into a paste with a bit of water, and then again put into a cow horn, and one goes in during the summer and one goes in during the winter. So the 500 goes in during the winter, the 501 goes in during the summer, and they work on the two different aspects, in the air and in the soil. So basically what they are is substances that call microorganisms to them. The microorganisms then break down these substances, but while they're breaking them down, they produce secondary metabolites, enzymes, and amino acids and things like that. So they're basically really potentized sources of energy for the land. So the 500, you get a barrel or spring water, because you don't want the chlorine in it, and you crumble the piece of about that big of the 500 into a barrel this big, and you stir it. And you stir it until you get a vortex. And then when you've got the vortex, you crash it back the other way. So you create order, and then you create chaos. And you do this for an hour. So it's a community thing, really. Everybody in the community has a go and has a laugh and does it. And then you spread it on the soil. When there's not so much UV energy that would destroy any of the substances that are in it. And what it does is it creates humus, creates more humus in the soil. They've done it. It's no doubt. They've done tests on it and everything. There's no doubt that it works. But up to that kind of explanation I've just given you, which is more of a biological, chemical kind of explanation of it, it was all etheric and astral, and people will be going. Especially trying to get it into Irish farmers. There was no way that was going to happen. Like, what the feck is he talking about? But there's a guy called David Wallace, who's now got the 12 disciples, 12 big farmers down in Kildare and Kilkenny, and he has done it Hugh Lovell's way. He's explained the whole biochemical, physical thing, and they are doing amazing stuff. They are doing amazing stuff. Like, they really are. Like, Trevor is an organic farmer. He's got a big farm, and I was down there about 8 years ago, and it was all right, but it was a bit, it wasn't top hole. And I saw him about 2 months ago, and he's now producing salads, and he's got so many places in Dublin after his salads. And he bought this big plastic box of salads, and the colours, you'd have to put sunglasses on. It was just the most beautiful, vibrant, biodynamics, So that's biodynamics. That's what biodynamics does. So a bit about the soil. Phenomenology. I have to talk about phenomenology. So to use science, to set up a scientific experiment, mainly you'd have to use scientific laboratory practices that most people can't afford. And like I said about nitrogen, I can't see nitrogen. I know apparently that nitrogen is responsible for green growth in plants, but so is sulfur, and there's a lot of other complex chemical things going on there. But what phenomenology means in our experience. So you've got onboard scientific equipment. You have you have ears that can hear, you have eyes that can see, you've got a tongue that can taste, and you've got fingers that can feel. You can use your own onboard scientific equipment to perceive what's going on in your farm. You don't need a scientist to come and tell you what's going on, in other words. Because if every time you go to the soil, you take a handful of soil, almost back to this sacred, this is what you do, this is your prayer at the beginning of your day. You take a handful of soil and you smell it. Every time you smell it, you make new neurological pathways in your brain that then allow you, the next time you smell it, to analyze things slightly different. And so over the years of doing it, you'll know what is anaerobic soil and what is aerobic soil, if there's minerals in the soil. Now there are some guys, I don't know any in, probably all dead now, the guys that I had, who would actually taste the soil. They would taste it and they would be able to tell you like what was going on in the soil, So this is phenomenology, and I really believe in phenomenology, because we are here mainly because our ancestors' power of observation, and we don't observe any longer. There's too much distraction going on. You know what I mean? To observe is to not look at something. To observe is to really look at something. You have to really see it, to see what it is, to see the essence of what it is, even. So I believe that as a species, as a human, we need to train these onboard senses more. Like if you want to look at your soil texture, you have to know whether it's clay or whether it's sand. Do you know what I mean? And they have two textures to them. You don't need a big piece of laboratory equipment to tell you that. So I believe we have, we should understand science enough to be involved in scientific experiments to prove things, or to put them out there so others can disprove them or prove them. But also, we have a lot of ability within our own selves to perceive the world around us. And then the microorganisms, it always starts off with bacteria. They're the smallest. Well, there's viroids and things like that, but they're the ones that are really breaking everything down. But there's a type of bacteria called archaea, and it's Greek. It means ancient things. So when the planet was first evolving and there was no oxygen, it was the archaea that made the oxygen, that allowed all of the other oxygen-breathing organisms to come along. Now, it lives in a few places. It's one of the bad things is because it releases methane, part of its biological process of living, whereas the anaerobic organisms, the plants and the flowers, they release oxygen rather than methane. But now, 10% of the organisms in your gut are archaea. So can you imagine this whole planet covered in little ponds of these organisms bubbling away under the water, producing methane? And where does it exist now? In the guts of cows and in the guts of humans. So that's the thing. I love the fact that I'm a walking tour bus. There's loads of things inside me, microorganisms living inside me, living on me. If you've ever seen the close-up of your skin on your face and all the little mites that are running around on it, I love it. Most people are freaked out about it, but once you understand that you are this out here, you're not this thing here, separate from all of this. You are this here, So after them and the bacteria Yeah, bacteria, there's 2.5 tons of bacteria for every acre that's out there. And they produce about a ton of urea. So that's half a ton of nitrogen a year on your soil if you have your biology going right. And then the air above us is mainly nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen and carbon. It's mainly those four, yeah? So don't you think that the evolution of plants and the nitrogen in the air, that either the great being or nature itself had worked out how to get that nitrogen into those plants before we came along and extracted it out of the air using tons and tons of energy to do it? Of course it does, but it's 72% nitrogen in the air. 72% to 80% nitrogen in the air, but it's N2. The form that plants eat is, or absorb rather, is N3, different form of nitrogen. So how does it become N3? Microorganisms. The microorganisms take the nitrogen that's in the air and in the air in the soil, and they turn it into N3, and this is what drives the whole plant system. So while they're turning off the gas pipeline to Europe from Russia, they've already shut down apparently 2 fertilizer factories in the UK. You know? And we don't think that we can farm without nitrogen. One of the big things is that the soil system is dependent upon warmth. Again, those 4 elements. You need warmth to make things grow. And farmers want things to grow before it's warm. And so soil life kicks in about 10 degrees. And so most farmers would say, well, it's backward if we don't use nitrogen fertilizer because we have to wait until for the soil to get 10 degrees. Now, if you've looked after your soil and you've got humus in there and it's black, it's sucking and holding more heat than a piece of conventional soil that's been compressed and misused over the time. So,
and does it take a long time for soil that's been badly, fertilized to regenerate?
No, you just have to start looking after it and realizing what it needs. This is a really tricky soil, this.
Yeah.
Should we go out and dig a hole while it's not raining? No, I'll tell you what it is. I've got my spade, but I'll tell you what it is. When you dig the soil here, because of that lime that I was talking about, is very fine, and so it compacts very easily. And another problem with it is that we've got lost there for a minute there. To get the nitrogen, that's what it is. It's hard to put organic matter into this soil because the pH is so high. And so pH means parts of hydrogen. So when you've got a really low pH, it's acidic. When you've got a high pH, it's alkaline or basic. We're alkaline or basic soil here because of the lime. So there's no acid to help in the breakdown of organic material. So to put organic material into this, that's why you don't have much tillage really. It's all pasture. It keeps the land protected. The pasture keeps the land protected. But if we're going to be involved in tillage, every time we break that soil and release all that nitrogen, and we try and or carbon dioxide, and we try to put organic matter into it, it can't break down because we can change the pH if we can rise the organic matter. It's called buffering. It buffers the pH. And so I've been pondering on this thing here for 10, 11 years now, and I reckon it's humates what we need. Humates are extracted from soft coals. We have our own deposits in the country, though nobody's using it. Soft coal, leonardite, which is before coal, after when it was trees, before it becomes coal and then on to diamonds. It is soft coal, it's called, and it's leonardite. You can also make humic acid from vermiculture, using worms. It's not the juice that drains out of the bottom. That stuff is fairly toxic. You need to throw that on a compost heap. It's making good worm compost, and then you take that good worm compost, you put it in a a sack or something and you soak it in water and you extract the humic acid out of it, and that's like putting organic matter into your soil. And what this soil needs is it needs to be kick-started. So I'd use I'd rake the surface to just break the surface, and then I'd have drips going in behind the rakes and dripping in humic acid, something like molasses, which is a carbohydrate. Well, it's more than carbohydrates. It's got lots of nutrients in it to feed the organisms. And the leachate from the from the worms, and that would then start to kick-start the system into creating more organic matter. Because the problem with the soil here is it's great when it's wet. When it dries, it's dust and it compacts. It's really stresses the plants out, and that's any organism that's stressed can then be attacked by pathogenic anything, like, you know what I mean. I've told Pat all this. There's a woman called New Zealand woman. She's got a book called For the Love of Soil. He'll come.
But are there other farmers like looking at that, say, even in this area, like as people want to move more to tillage?
Is there? No, at the moment, farmers farmers are caught. Conventional farmers are caught in a position of between guilt and failure, kind of. It's like a feeling that everybody's picking on them. You know what I mean? But the fact is, they were taught by somebody. The way that conventional farmers farm is because they were told that they needed to farm like this for exports and for economics and everything like that. And now it looks like the government and the Department of Agriculture are turning around on the farmers and saying, look at the mess you've made of the place. I don't think any farmer really wants to destroy their land, their water, their air, or their community. But it's hard now for farmers. There's no better time, really. Our government is lax because the power behind the throne is still there. The Wizard of Oz is still there. The corporations are still, the power is still coming through there. But I think, small farm used to be 60 acres. You can't make a living off of 60 acres now. Why can't you make a living off of 60 acres? There's people making a living off of a piece of shed this big growing microgreens and things like this. The reason they're not making a living is because they haven't got a diversified, connected, ecological farm working. And another thing is, not enough people work on farms now. This has been going on since I came to Ireland 30 years ago down in East Clare there, and they're not big farmers down in East Clare because of the drumlins down there. The amount of suicides in farmers, they don't see anybody. A lot of them would be older men who just never married, and then they're just on the farm all day by themselves, kind of, there's no farm hands around or whatever, can't afford to pay them. And
farm comes to mind, definitely the one in a semi-meadow farm. If it's a Dermot, it's doing a really
Dermot's a great guy, yeah, he is. But see, you need more. Again, we have to get over that property thing. This is mine, and you can't have it. In fact, if I invite you in, it's going to make things better for all of us. There's a guy called Dominic Grayson. He's on a farm over on the Dublin Meath border there, and Dominic is crazy about grains and diversity in grains. His whole family have got enterprises on the farm. His wife has got a llama trekking business on there. His son does one thing and his daughter does. They've just made this thing really alive and exciting to be on, And when I came back from California, that was the first thing when I came in here was, if we want young people to be on farms and to have that grow and that, want to be working on the farms and experiment and everything, we have to make it a fun place. We have to have tree houses and swimming pools or mud pools or anything that we would have liked to have done when we were kids, I don't know so much about the tech, but that's because of the age I come from, and I know there's good in it. I use it every day, but I see the duplicitousness in it, the badness in it, and I don't think it's taken us in a good direction, really. You know, we have no control over it. We're like children let go in a nuclear reactor facility. We have no idea what we're doing with this technology and who's doing what to us or what, you know. So I just think to make farms interesting, we have to make them fun again. We have to make them diverse and open them up and not be so fearful. I mean, I can understand the whole thing of land in Ireland. You know, I can understand it when you weren't allowed to have land, you know, as a Catholic, or you weren't allowed to have, like where I lived in Clare, I lived up in Scleeve, Ochties, and on an old farm that was fairly, you know, boggy and run down kind of thing, because they weren't allowed to have the land down by Lochberg, because the fish, and they could have fish then, you know, and then you have like Mount Shannon, which was a Protestant village, and they were sent up at so the Catholics were sent up into the hills and that. So I can understand that kind of land thing. But if we don't open it up, the land doesn't become part of us. You know, it's somebody else's land. And again, I think we have a big thing with polarity, a big problem with polarity. You know, we know that you know, divide and conquer. We know that. But why do we keep doing it to ourselves, you know? I'm a man, you're a woman, you're black, you're white, you're green, you're blue. We are one. We are one. We are the oneness. Us. You know, we have the ability to do all of these great things. So we get off our asses and do it.
Great pace to end. 2 hours at this stage, Kevin. It's been just amazing.
That's it, then.
Font of information.
I'm somewhere on the spectrum.
We all.
We are.
And we're all one.
Yeah, exactly. But mine manifests itself in that thing of a bit like Blind Boy Boat Club, really. If you know Blind Boy Boat Club, I'm just obsessed about things.
It's a lovely
You know.
obsession, and I mean,
Well,
we're
you know,
all obsessed.
I went from an obsession of 60 varieties of gooseberries when I first came to Ireland. So then you realise you can't grow gooseberries in a shit piece of land. So then you have to look down into the land. And I'll tell you now, it's never ending. You will learn all of your life and all of your next life and all of the life, because it will fill you up over and over and over again, what there is there, like, you know. And then hopefully we can return to that true spirituality, you know, where we see each other as one and being one of the land, and we become, you know, you know, you only receive if you give.